Hello, I'm C.A. Brill, the author of Why Christians Should Oppose Christian Nationalism, and today I'm going to be giving a response to William Wolfe. William Wolfe, I actually managed to engage him a little bit on Twitter when I announced an interview regarding my book, and then he made a response to a statement I had made, and the statement I had made was a bit of a bold statement, and I had tagged him on Twitter. There are now serious questions over the scriptural validity of Christian nationalism. So William Wolfe was one of the people I tagged because I want to actually engage with people who are in favor of the idea of Christian nationalism, because I think I have some pretty strong arguments against their position. So anyway, William Wolfe did indeed respond, and how he responded is pretty simple. He tweeted, and so now I am going to show you a little bit of what I mean by this idea. So I'm going to just quickly show you. There you go. This is Twitter. I don't do dark on Twitter. I do light, opposite on Discord. I do dark theme on Discord. But here it is, William Wolfe responding to me. I'm also known as Anawiltos on social media. And of course, this is going on the channel Anawiltos, so obviously there. Some scriptural support for Christian nationalism, not exhaustive. So William Wolfe claims that there does indeed exist scriptural support for Christian nationalism. And that is, of course, the thing that I am disputing, that there is indeed not scriptural support for Christian nationalism. And therefore, let's get into that. Psalm 2, 10-12. Therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and celebrate his rule with trembling. Kiss his son, or he will be angry, and your way will lead to your destruction. Now, as some of you may know, I do actually cite Psalm 2 in my book, so I am entirely familiar with what this passage says. And we have to ask ourselves, is this nationalism? Because obviously, Christians do acknowledge that rulers ought to love the Son, they ought to serve the Lord, that they ought to, not just rulers, but everyone, ought to obey God. And so then the question is, does this actually support nationalism specifically? And the answer is no, because this just talks about kings. And of course, there are many kings. And some kings are kings over nation states. Although back then there were tribal kings, which is, I guess you could say, is the closest thing to a nation state, even though it's conceptually a lot different than a nation state, which is an idea that I go into in my book. And then there's kings over empires. And they're not kings over nations. But this speaks generally. So would this mean that kings of empires ought not to do this? Well, obviously not. And I don't think William Wolfe would take that position either, that kings over empires ought to have a different duty. So the question then is, where is the nationalism in this passage? And the answer is, there is no nationalism in this passage. And the thing I am disputing specifically is nationalism. And what is nationalism? Well, nationalism is a specific ideology that developed in the late 1700s and throughout the 1800s, and more so in the 20th century even. And it's still developing today. There's still variants of it coming out. There's different ways people like to interpret it. And of course, there were some preceding ideas of nationalism, but a thing to be known here is that nationalism has this core idea that the nation is the organizing principle of the state. So there's the national identity, should be very important, and that the state should be organized around a nation. And what is a nation? A nation is a people group. A nation is not the ruler, it is not the government, it is not the land, it is the people group. It is the people. The people are the nation. Now, of course, different people groups have different ways in which they define their identity, and that is something that certainly should be understood and gotten into. But does this passage talk about people groups? It does not. And a consequence of the state being centered on people groups is the establishment of the nation state, or the state wherein the nation is sovereign, which has the idea of popular sovereignty, which I think is a very unbiblical concept. But I'm not going to get into that because I wrote a whole book where there's a whole chapter about that. So, and my purpose here is merely to make objections to William Wolfe's assertions. So does Psalm 2, 10 through 12, or even the broader context, allow for Christian nationalism? No, it does not. Well, it obviously would include king's rule under a nationalist system. It does not specifically support Christian nationalism. And obviously his statement is not exhaustive. So I'm certain that there's other arguments that William Wolfe can come up with. But let's look at the next one. Acts 17:26. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. And that's true. God did create nations. And these nations do have various places in which they live. Each nation has a homeland. And then the question then becomes, does this mean that the assertion here is correct? And the answer, though, I think, is that this also does not actually support nationalism. And why does it not support nationalism? Well, because the existence of nations does not mean that nationalism as a political ideology is either true or morally necessary. Just because nations exist does not mean that nationalism exists. Just because nations exist does not mean that organizing states around the idea of a nation is morally necessary. In fact, this is written in the context of the Roman Empire, which is obviously, while it was founded by a particular nation and contains very many nations, is not a nation state. It's an empire. Now, that's not to say that this passage, therefore, has that implication regarding the empire. But the point I'm trying to make here is that this passage actually has zero political implications. It does not. Where's the political implication? Well, what this passage says is that from Adam, there were different people groups emerged, and they dwell on the earth, and God has providentially given them times and places wherein they live. Does that mean that they have an eternal right to that, to live in all those places? Well, the answer is actually no, because we see this in during the Exodus when God commands Israel to invade Canaan and to displace the natives of that land. So their land was not their permanent habitation. We also see this in Jeremiah 27, when Nebuchadnezzar is given authority to conquer various nations, and those who resist him will be displaced from their homelands. And that is those are instances where these things change. And these things also change all the time for various other reasons. People might migrate, people might live somewhere else. There might be an ethnogenesis where what was once a nation in one place splits off to another nation, or two nations might merge together. And in the case of America, for example, it's hard to really speak to that without mentioning the idea of ethnogenesis, without mentioning the idea that nations actually change and they morph and they evolve in some ways, that nations that once did not exist now exist, and nations which then now exist perhaps did not once exist. So the American nation, the American people group, is not something that always existed, and is something that came into being at one point. And then there's the question of people having different identities, or to say multiple national identities, and which one they should favor. For example, in Germany, you've got, of course, the people who have a German ethnicity, but you also have people who prefer, and these are people are a bit less common nowadays, but there were people who preferred their older nationalities that preceded that. For example, you've got the Alemannic people who have an ethnicity which is considered a sub-ethnicity of the German ethnicity, but back then, when Germany was being founded, could have been considered an ethnicity of its own as well. Bavarians, Saxons, Franks, those all are nations, and those all have, to some extent, been merged with various other nations. And so saying that God providentially establishes some things does not necessarily mean that those things have an eternal character to them. So let's look at Romans 13:4. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Now, of course, that is not the only part of here that is relevant. I believe another relevant part is more of the beginning here. So of chapter 13, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. So in that context, it may be said that rulership is on divine right rather than by popular sovereignty. So that, of course, is contradictory to the nationalistic idea. Because, of course, those who are in authority are God's servants. So whose servants are they? They're not the servants of the nation, they're the servants of God. Now, of course, William Wolfe understands this. He says, very important in Romans 13:4, Paul twice repeats the teaching that government is God's servant, theu diakonos, and particularly that this servant of God must exercise his derivative authority for the good of the people he governs. And that is true. People who govern ought to govern on behalf of God, and that they govern ought to be good, obviously. So I don't see how this in any way supports nationalism, because if you read deeper into it, if you read the preceding passages, it actually seems to oppose nationalism by saying that the authority of rulers comes from God rather than from the people. Now, of course, rulers have a duty not only to God, but also to the people that they govern, to govern them well. However, this is not the same thing as nationalism. So it seems to me that William Wolfe either, perhaps he might not understand my objections to Christian nationalism, but in putting forward this passage, he seems to actually in some ways be inconsistent in his usage of the term nationalism, or at least in his understanding of what nationalism is. That is not necessarily inconsistent with himself, but inconsistent with the general concept of what nationalism is. Consider this: in order for servants to be faithful, they must, one, know who their master is. True. Two, know what their master expects of them. Yes. And three, discharge their duties faithfully. Who is the master and the servant? That is the government, God. That's true. God is the master of that. Now, that being said, I actually think that there is a bit of an excessive emphasis here on them doing their duties well, because I don't think that the Romans 13, 1 and 2 are predicated on the idea that they are doing it well. I think that in my interpretation, I understand that people disagree with this, that these rulers are appointed by God or ordained of God or established by God, whichever translation you want to utilize, regardless of their faithfulness. And because of that, even though they might be unfaithful, they still have a duty to God. So, of course, if you go back to Romans 1 and 2, obviously the idea that their rulers ought to know who their master is true, and that they actually do know who their master is, even if they are self-deceived on that, and that they have at least some understanding of morality as God has commanded it, and that therefore they have a duty to discharge their duties faithfully. And that is true not just of Christian rulers, but also of pagan rulers, because they are without excuse on these things. And to some extent, there is some degree of competence, as we see in Romans 2, that even non-Christians can have some degree of competence. Now, obviously, they are not, that does not overcome their sin. They do not enter into the ability to please God in the things that they do, but they do have necessarily some kind of competence, as is understood in Romans 2. And we understand this through the concept of common grace, that there's a common grace that God gives to all people, not just to those who he saves, but to others as well. And you see this also in the way Abraham Kuyper, the Dutch politician and theologian, understood the political system in his society, that there were different religious groups who had different standards, but ultimately God is behind it all, even the virtues, the good virtues of people who oppose God is behind the goodness of those virtues, even if they themselves are not ultimately good in those individuals. So that's a bit of an exploration of common grace there. But the point here that I'm trying to make is that this, once again, doesn't really have anything to do with nationalism. So how exactly is this a scriptural support for Christian nationalism? The answer is it is not. It is a scriptural support for divine right of rulers. That is true. It is a scriptural support for the duty that rulers have to God and to do good. That is true. But it is not a scriptural support for the idea that nationalism is necessarily the way that this should go out. So, what does God expect of government? To use their authority for the good of the people they rule. Yes. And this is understood not just by Christian nationalists, but also by non-nationalists. For example, King James. Some people might know this, not know this, that he is a political philosopher. He writes in Basilicon Doron that the ruler has particular duties to his subjects, and he also, in the True Law of Free Monarchies, he goes into the specific passages of scripture that detail what the duties of rulers are and such things. Now, I don't agree with everything he says, but he is not a nationalist, yet he affirms these same things. So this is not a uniquely nationalist idea here, and therefore it is not something that specifically supports Christian nationalism. So let's continue. What does God expect of government? To use their authority for the good of the people they rule. What does faithfulness in this role look like? Rightly punishing evil and praising good according to God's moral standards. That's true. That's true. And of course, this was written also in the context of the Roman Empire. So this does not necessarily mean that the rewarding of the good is the same way, should be understood in the same way that we understand redemption and goodness in that context, but rather perhaps in a more general and outward sense, as we would perhaps go back to Romans 2, that there is a common grace understanding of good that even pagan rulers have, and that they ought to do that. Now, of course, a ruler is better if he is a Christian ruler, all other things being equal, that is. However, I would say that while I disagree with the idea that so-called virtuous pagans can achieve salvation, I do agree with the idea that a so-called virtuous pagan, or a pagan who is becomes obedient to common grace virtues, is better as a ruler than an actual Christian who is incompetent as a ruler. In the same way that I agree with the idea that an electrician who is competent at what he does is better than an electrician who is incompetent but is a Christian. So I see this as I see politics and statecraft specifically as a type of science, that there are good things and necessarily good things and good ways to organize things in government, and have written books about this, of course. But these things are not necessarily linked with the redemption of the person accomplishing them. Now, obviously, the redemption of the person accomplishing them is better, and that's why we see in 1 Peter 2, we are to pray for our rulers, and obviously we pray for their salvation, but we also have obedience to them despite the fact that they are not saved. As it says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. But of course, we ought to be obey God more than men. So there are obviously instances in which if there's a conflict between the magistrate which God has put over us and between the ultimate authority, God himself, we obviously have to go with the ultimate authority. But that does not mean that the magistrate is illegitimate if he is immoral in some way. And I think that that's perhaps something that is lost on a lot of liberals. And a lot of Christians today are liberals or nationalists or other kinds of Enlightenment ideologies in the way they view politics. So they tend to view rebellion a lot more favorably than, let's say, Martin Luther, who wrote against the murdering, thieving hordes of peasants and such things. That's a classic Martin Luther read. Or John Jewel, the Low Church English bishop who wrote an homily against disobedience and willful rebellion to specifically counteract some things that John Knox was saying, where John Knox had come into a disagreement with John Calvin over the legitimacy of women as rulers, whether women could rule, and whether, therefore, the people of a country ought to be obedient to women as rulers. And I think that what John Knox was doing there was actually, in many ways, a seed of corruption. in the way a lot of churches view politics. I take a more conservative viewpoint that rulers should only be opposed if they require you to oppose God in what you do or to forsake your duties. Whereas a lot of people take a more broad sense, take different perspectives. For example, there's people that take the perspective that the people in general have a covenant with their rulers, which I would categorically deny that such a thing generally exists. But that's a bit of an elaboration. But anyway, he continues with what is an eminently false dichotomy. Should we be globalists? No, that's an effort to rebuild Babel. Genesis 11, 1 through 9. Therefore, we should be nationalists. This is a false dichotomy. There are more than two ideologies in the world. Globalism is actually not even the opposite of nationalism. If you read Chapter 1, Article 1 of the UN Charter, which many people consider the UN to be a force for globalism in the world. Article 1 of Chapter 1 of the UN Charter, where they put their Declaration of Principles, they affirm the self-determination of peoples and a world composed of discrete nations that they then hope to cooperate with each other. So globalism, in many ways, emerged out of the inherent weaknesses of nationalism through nationalism's opposition to imperialism and colonialism, where after World War I and World War II, a lot of people wanted to decolonize. So a lot of new so-called nation states were established throughout the world, and they couldn't really be self-reliant, so they had to rely on each other, and that's how the enforcement of nationalism creates globalism. Nationalists produce globalists. I think that's something that a lot of people don't really realize. A lot of people have such a hard dichotomy because of the cultural context that they live in, that it's ingrained in them that it's either your own country or the rest of the world together. That's not a true dichotomy. That's like saying that there's two cities in the United States that you can live in, New York and LA, when there's actually a lot of different cities and they're not all huge metropolitan cities. There's imperialism, there's colonialism, there's socialism, there's federalism. If we want to talk about Christian ideologies, we can talk about ecclesiocracy, we can talk about sacralism, we can talk about theonomy. And theonomy is not nationalistic, not inherently anyway. Theonomists can be nationalistic, but I would argue that if theonomists become nationalistic, they actually, in some ways, become less theonomic. And you can read in my book about why that is the case. I don't say that specifically in the book, but when I talk about relationalism versus identitarianism, I put forward the idea that the Old Testament law is relational rather than identitarian, and those are concepts that about how polities are organized that I think are important to understand. But ecclesiocracy, sacralism, Christian federalism. Ever read Johannes Alphusius? That's a great read. I cite that in one of my previous works. It's a great. It's very well thought out. Abraham Kuyper, you've got pillarization. There's a lot of different ways that Christians organize government historically, and not just that. There's lots of ways to organize governments in general that are not nationalistic. Through the experience of many different cultures, you can string together thousands of years of political philosophy that is non-nationalistic and non-globalistic and non-liberalistic and non-socialistic and just non-populistic, non-enlightenment. Okay, and I think that's the problem, that people are getting stuck in the box of the context of the Enlightenment, uh, 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 an intellectual development that occurred in the modern day. It's a type of modernism that people are getting stuck in with nationalism and globalism. There's lots of different types of governments. There's classical republicanism, which is uh, the idea of establishing a republic without the errors of liberalism. Um, there's, of course, I mentioned federalism. There's ancient Chinese legalism. There's all sorts of different ways that people have organized government, ways that people have theorized the organization of government. So when somebody says you have to be a nationalist because you don't want to be a globalist, then that's eminently, I think, either highly ignorant or deceptive. And I hope that William Wolfe is ignorant and not deceptive, because if he's deceptive, then there's still hope, but there's less hope. Say, and that's why one of the things I write in my book is that a lot of people make these false dichotomies. A lot of people call nationalism what is not nationalism, and do not call nationalism what is nationalism. People have errors in categories, and that's why definitions are important. When the Pharisees started to redefine the laws in order to make themselves seem more pious, Jesus rebuked them. And likewise, I think we need to understand nationalism in the context of its history and in the context of the usage of the term. So if you want to call yourself a nationalist, but all you are is a theonomist, and you don't believe in popular sovereignty and in the self-determination of peoples and in identitarianism, then don't call yourself a nationalist. Just be a theonomist. But let's actually go to Genesis 11, 1 through 9, because I think that this is actually a silly assertion. I had actually made a response tweet to William Wolfe answering many of the problems that I thought were being brought forward. I didn't address this point because I think that this point would have been a bit too pedantic to address in a tweet, but because I'm speaking and I have the time, I might as well talk about it. So what is the reason why people built the Tower of Babel? Well, I'm going to read the KJV says, and they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And I'll also read NASB for additional translation. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let's make a name for ourselves, otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of all the earth. So what is the exact problem with the Tower of Babel? Well, the Lord says, and the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. Now, there's a lot of different theories as to the exact details of what they were trying to do with the Tower of Babel, but there's a couple of things, of course. One is that they were exalting themselves. They were trying to exalt their own achievements over God, and so they another one is that they wanted to reach the level of God, and there's theories as to whether they actually wanted to try to reach into heaven, or whether they just were trying to build a high tower to indicate their preeminence. And another element here is that they had gathered together when God told them to inhabit the whole earth, to go to different places in the earth. And so in that sense, there was a bit of a disobedience there. Now, is that what globalism is? I don't think it is. I don't think that that's what globalism is. Because what is globalism? Well, some people might say we want to unite the world into one government, and that's one way to look at globalism. Another way to look at it is people saying different nation states should cooperate with each other, which is what the UN uh, attempts to do. It's to create a forum for cooperation between different nations. Now, I'm not a globalist, nor am I a nationalist, but when we talk about building the Tower of Babel, there's a specific context and a specific implication here that I don't think is brought out in either of the two ideals of globalism. Now, obviously, there are people who want to unite the world because they think that humanity can accomplish all things. There's secular humanists who believe that. That's true. That not that they can accomplish all things, but that they believe that. But is that the same thing as what the Tower of Babel is? It might be. But is that what all the globalists want? No, I don't think it is. There's just some people that want globalism for peace. There's some people that want it for economic prosperity. There's some people that want it for opportunities. And I think it is bearing false witness. I think it is, perhaps not bearing false witness, but irresponsible to accuse them of this same sin. Because is there something inherently wrong with people speaking the same language? I don't think there is. Is there something inherently wrong with people communicating throughout the whole world? I don't think there is. I don't think there's something inherently wrong with different people from the world cooperating. As we see, of course, in the prophecies, all the nations go to Jerusalem and they worship Jesus Christ as king. And Jesus puts all the world under his feet. He conquers everything. So there's, in a way, an understanding that those things are not inherently wrong. So I don't really see how this follows. And I think this is very shallow exegesis. Because if you want to say this, if you want to say that they're just trying to rebuild the Tower of Babel, then you have to actually more substantially prove that. Otherwise, it's an empty accusation and, frankly, somewhat pedantic. But anyway, let's move on from there. Then what kind of nationalists should we be? Well, my opinion is we should not be nationalists. Okay? My opinion is that God is sovereign. The people are not sovereign. God has ordained the rulers, and as such, the people do not have a right to countermand God's ordination. Now, does that mean that republics don't hook? Well, no, of course not. In the context of Romans 13, that speaks to the Roman state, which consisted of both monarchies and republics, and an ultimate governmental structure which had a mixture of both types of institutions, and of course different local governments under that. So in that sense, all of those, even rulers of republics, rule by divine right. But the question then is, do the people have a right to overthrow their ruler if they don't think he's doing it right? No. Do the people have an inherently superior position to their king? Well, the answer is no. Why? Because, for one, it seems in Romans 13 that it is established in a hierarchy: God, then the earthly ruler, then the subjects of the ruler. There's a hierarchy there. But also, because of the structure of Christ's kingdom. Jesus Christ is king. The people, the body of Christ, does not have a right to rebel against the head. So I think that nationalism as an ideology, as we saw in 1848, there were several nationalist rebellions against various kingdoms throughout Europe. Nationalism is, in many ways, something that contributes to rebellion, not just against earthly rulers, but also against, by extension of God's ordaining of those rulers, against God. So that is a huge problem. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Exactly. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Now, some people like to say, because we have to make disciples of all nations, that means that the nations themselves can become disciples. Well, the problem is that, logically speaking, that does not make sense. Why? Well, because what is a nation? Well, a nation is a people group. How do you make an entire people group a disciple? Well, you would have to make every member of that people group a disciple. Because those who are not disciples and are members of that people group, therefore, would not count towards the discipleness of the nation. And nations don't have a collective will. They don't have an intrinsic majoritarian nature to them. Those are things that people like to ascribe to nations, but that's, in the real world, that's not really how nations work. Nations are just people groups. They're just groups of people that have some things in common. So, in that sense, can a nation itself become a disciple? Well, obviously, there is the holy nation that is mentioned in Exodus 19 and in 1 Peter 2, but that is, of course, ancient Israel and the church. And how does one become a member of that nation? Well, how does one become a national, someone who is born into a nation? Well, you're born. Well, how do you then become a national of the church? You are born again. You have a spiritual birth. And therefore, the real Christian nation is the church. It is not any earthly nation, it is the church. Does that mean that earthly nations are wicked and that they cannot follow God in any sense? Well, no. Collectively, they cannot, because that they don't operate collectively. That's not a real thing that happens. But their members can, and the states which they establish can. And once again, I think an important distinction is to be made here. The nation and the state are not the same. A lot of people like to merge them, but I think that that's logically wrong to merge them, because not every member of a nation has equal authority. And ultimately, as a body of many members, a nation has to have a head of some sort, and the head is then the sovereign of that. So we as Christians in the church, in the holy nation, do not have sovereignty over the church collectively. Rather, it is Jesus Christ, who is the head of the church, that has sovereignty over the church. Likewise, nations don't have sovereignty over themselves collectively. Rather, it is the ruler of a state that controls a particular nation that has sovereignty over them. And nations can be controlled by multiple states simultaneously, and a state can control multiple nations simultaneously, as Cyrus the Great did, as we see in Isaiah 45, that he conquered many different countries. So, therefore, that is a problem. Also, salvation is something that happens individually. As Jesus says, I came not to bring peace, but a sword, and father and son will be divided, and mother and daughter will be divided against each other. And he talks about that. And so the bonds of kinship that we have in earthly nations are actually not related to the spiritual bond that we have as Christians. And even if you were to say, let's say you're a postmillennial and you believe that at one point most or all members of living members of nations are then disciples of Christ, then what about their dead ancestors, the people that came around perhaps before these nations became Christianized? They're not Christian, and they're part of the nation. So do they now cease to be part of a nation due to its Christianization? or is there something else happening? And that's why I say that there's one Christian nation, and that is the church, just like there's one head thereof, Jesus Christ. And I think that that's an important understanding that people ought to have. Now, anyway, thank you for listening. I hope that this has been informative to people. I'm sure there's a lot of questions people would like to ask about this, and I've written a book about this. So if you have any questions, read my book. I'll leave a link in the description below so that anybody who has questions can read it. I'm also making a video series explaining the book, so that's another thing that people can look at if they want to. But anyway, I've been C.A. Brill. Thank you all for watching. And I hope that William Wolfe comes to understand some things that I think he does not understand. I think that he probably is a very solid person, but I think that he has some errors in his understanding of political theology and political philosophy, especially when it concerns the Christian nation and Christian nationalism. So I think regardless of what your opinion is on these issues, it's important to be able to come together as brothers in Christ and discuss these things. I am sometimes a bit polemical in the things I say, but regardless of that, I do hope that my love shines through, that there is no animosity here. There should not be animosity. But this is, of course, a serious matter because, of course, as is written in Romans 13, the ruler has a sword. He has the political authority to do various things, and that has strong implications because if you therefore, if he misapplies a sword, if he runs a state in a way that is unjust, then people die. So it's a serious matter, so it should not be taken lightly, but I think it is something that hopefully can be resolved through discussion among faithful Christians. Anyway, thank you all, and I'll be seeing you all next time. Over and out.